बाजी पहला सुख का काल सुख की अग्नि कौन बुझाए सुख गए सब तार जिन हाथों में होती रोले आज वही कंगाल मुसाफिर आज वही कंगाल भूखा है बंगाल भूखा है बंगाल कोठरियों में गाजे बैठे बनिए सारा नाथ कोठरियों में गाजे बैठे बनिए सारा नाथ
सुंदर नारी भूख की मारी बेचे घर घर लाल सुंदर नारी भूख की मारी बेचे घर घर लाल
चौपट नगरी कौन संभाले चौपट नगरी कौन संभाले चारों तरफ पहुंचार साथी चारों तरफ पहुंचार भूखा है बंगाल भूखा है बंगाल
British views on Indian peasants during colonial rule were complex. While some officials held paternalistic attitudes, perceiving them as backward and in need of guidance, others acknowledged their vital role in agriculture. The peasants were seen as resilient and hard-working, contributing significantly to the agrarian economy. However, the policies imposed by the British often exploited the peasants, leading to increased poverty, indebtedness, and a sense of dependence on the colonial system. The exploitation of land revenue, stringent taxation, and unfair practices further exacerbated the plight of Indian peasants, undermining their economic and social well-being under British rule. In this video, we take a look at several peasant movements that occurred in British India during the colonial period, reflecting agrarian discontent and resistance against oppressive policies. The Chakma Revolt was an uprising against British colonial rule in the Chittagong Hill tracts of Bengal, India, during the 19th century. Led by the Chakma people, it was a response to oppressive land policies, high taxes, and forced labor imposed by the British administration. The Chakmas, an indigenous community, protested against these injustices, seeking autonomy and control over their lands. The revolt, marked by sporadic resistance and clashes, continued for several years, with the Chakmas demanding the restoration of their traditional rights and freedoms. The British responded with military force, leading to a quelling of the rebellion. The uprising, while not entirely successful, highlighted the indigenous population's struggle against colonial exploitation and their quest for autonomy in British India's frontier regions. The Santhal Rebellion of 1855-1856 was a significant tribal uprising in British India, led by the Santhal tribe, primarily in the region of present-day Jharkhand and parts of West Bengal and Bihar. The Santhals were an Adivasi indigenous tribe who faced oppression, exploitation, and displacement by the British colonial administration, as well as moneylenders and landlords. They were subjected to heavy taxation, forced labor, and loss of their traditional lands. Two brothers, Sidhu and Kanhu, emerged as prominent leaders of the Santhals. They played a pivotal role in uniting the Santhal community against the British and their exploitative practices, the Santhal. The rebellion began on June 30th, 1855, when the Santhals, armed with traditional weapons and spears, attacked British officials, moneylenders, and landlords. They declared their intention to establish a Hul, or Santhal state. The rebellion spread rapidly across the region. The Santhals engaged in armed confrontations with British forces, and a series of battles ensued. The rebels employed guerrilla warfare tactics to fight the better-equipped British troops. The British responded with force, and a brutal crackdown on the Santhal rebellion followed. Thousands of Santhals were killed and many were captured and executed. The British authorities reasserted control over the region. The rebellion ultimately failed, but it served as a symbol of resistance against British colonialism and inspired future movements for tribal rights and autonomy. The Santhal Rebellion is remembered as one of the earliest tribal uprisings in India's struggle for independence. The Indigo Revolt, also known as the Indigo Rebellion, was a pivotal agrarian uprising that transpired in Bengal, India, during the latter half of the 19th century. This revolt was a vehement response to the exploitative indigo plantation system imposed by the British colonial rulers in India. The initial events of the Indigo Revolt unfolded in the 1850s, when indigo farmers, primarily impoverished peasants, were coerced into cultivating indigo crops instead of food crops. This indigo was utilized for dye production, which proved highly profitable for the British planters, but caused acute suffering for the local peasants who were subjected to economic exploitation, harsh working conditions, and abysmal living standards. The uprising gained momentum with a series of protests, clashes, and acts of civil disobedience, notably under the leadership of figures like Digambar Biswas and Bishnu Biswas. The culmination of the revolt occurred in 1859 when, under mounting pressure, British authorities abolished the oppressive Tinkathia system, which had been a major source of agrarian exploitation. This marked a turning point, granting relief to the indigo cultivators and leading to the eventual decline of indigo cultivation in the region. The Indigo Revolt exemplifies the resilience of oppressed peasants and the effectiveness of collective action in challenging oppressive colonial rule. It stands as a significant chapter in India's struggle for independence and agrarian reform, highlighting the capacity of marginalized communities to advocate for their rights. The Indigo Revolt was a momentous event in the history of India's struggle for freedom and justice. It underscored the tenacity of the indigo farmers in their fight against economic oppression and exploitative systems. Ultimately, their collective efforts led to positive changes in their living conditions and brought an end to the exploitative indigo cultivation practices, demonstrating the power of grassroots movements in challenging colonial injustices. The Deccan Uprising, spanning from 1875 to 1877, was a significant peasant revolt in the Deccan region of India, encompassing parts of present-day Maharashtra and Karnataka. The uprising was a response to the economic distress and oppressive conditions faced by the rural population due to high taxation, usurious practices of moneylenders, and exploitative land revenue systems introduced by the British colonial administration. Led by Vasudeo Balwan Phadke, the movement sought to challenge the economic exploitation faced by the agrarian community. Phadke, a revolutionary, organized and led protests aiming to free the peasants from the burdens of debt and to establish social justice and fairer economic conditions. The British authorities, in response to the escalating resistance, employed military force to suppress the revolt. Phadke was captured, tried, and ultimately executed in 1883. The uprising, although quelled, underscored the grievances of the rural populace against the unjust economic policies imposed by the British, emphasizing the disparities and hardships faced by the agrarian communities during the colonial period in India. This uprising contributed to the growing discontent and resistance against exploitative systems in colonial India, inspiring future movements for social justice and agrarian rights. The Champaran Satyagraha of 1917 took place in the Champaran district of Bihar. It was centered around the exploitation of indigo farmers by British indigo planters. Gandhi, at the request of local farmers, intervened and organized protests against the unjust indigo cultivation system, which compelled farmers to grow indigo on a portion of their land. Through non-violent resistance and negotiations, Gandhi successfully led the farmers in their struggle for fair land rights and better working conditions. The Kheda Satyagraha occurred in 1918 in the Kheda district of Gujarat. Peasants were unable to pay taxes due to a widespread crop failure caused by floods and famine. Gandhi supported the peasants' cause and initiated a non-violent resistance movement against the British government's tax policies. Despite the crop failures, the British were unwilling to provide any relief. However, through persistent non-violent protests and civil disobedience, the government eventually relented and accepted the demand for tax exemption. Both the Champaran and Kheda revolts marked the beginning of Gandhi's organized, non-violent civil disobedience campaigns and played a pivotal role in shaping the Indian freedom movement's strategies against oppressive colonial rule. These movements demonstrated the power of peaceful protest and resistance in achieving justice and fair treatment for the oppressed. The Bardoli Satyagraha was a significant event in India's independence movement led by Mahatma Gandhi in 1928. It took place in Bardoli, a town in Gujarat. The movement was a response to the British government's decision to increase the land revenue assessments by 22% despite poor crop yields and economic hardships faced by the farmers. Under the guidance of Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel, the farmers of Bardoli vehemently opposed the unfair tax increase. Following Gandhi's principles of non-violent resistance, they refused to pay the increased taxes. The Satyagraha, characterized by civil disobedience and peaceful protests, garnered widespread support. Due to the resolute non-cooperation of the villagers and the sympathetic attention it received from various parts of the country, the British authorities were compelled to negotiate. Eventually, a settlement was reached, and the government agreed to roll back the increased taxes, providing relief to the farmers. The success of the Bardoli Satyagraha not only provided economic relief, but also became a symbol of peaceful resistance and solidarity in the fight for Indian independence. Under British rule during the Bengal famine of 1943, though not a traditional peasant movement, but farmers faced exacerbated hardship. British policies, including resource hoarding for the war, continued exportation of grains, and inadequate relief efforts, directly contributed to the severity of the famine's impact. Farmers, already grappling with crop failures due to natural disasters, suffered intensified economic ruin. The requisitioning of resources for the war effort led to acute food scarcity, pushing farmers to sell their land and livestock to afford inflated food prices. British taxation policies exacerbated their financial distress. Moreover, the lack of timely and effective relief measures deepened the plight of the farming communities. This catastrophic combination of factors not only led to malnutrition, increased mortality, and economic devastation, but also fostered resentment and a re-evaluation of British colonial policies and their neglect of the welfare of the local populace. The Bengal famine of 1943, compounded by British policies, led to dire consequences for farmers, deepening economic ruin, acute food scarcity, and widespread suffering. The catastrophic impact underscored the devastating consequences of colonial neglect, reshaping perspectives on governance and humanitarian responsibilities. Peasant revolts in British India reflected the socio-economic distress and discontent among rural communities. These uprisings conveyed the resistance against exploitative policies, oppressive taxation, and land disputes. While some revolts were locally contained, they collectively highlighted the struggle against British rule and the quest for social justice. These uprisings symbolized the spirit of patriotism and the fight for economic and social justice. Despite being locally contained, these revolts collectively echoed the fervor for independence, shaping India's path towards sovereignty.